Yeah.
Yeah. So it's if you were in media long enough, you knew the kinds of stories that people actually read, not the ones they said they read and they pretended they read. So it was really easy to look at what was there and figure out what would work on Dig and to write headlines.
So again, sensationalism, is that what you're saying? Great titles.
It's, well, you know what, I mean, I hate to say sensationalism to an extent. That's what people like. I mean, I don't care what people say. That's what people like.
If it bleeds,
it leads. Totally.
Yeah.
But really recognizing what people want. You know, you have to give them that meat and potatoes too. And I always advocate that you do that. That, you know, when I do presentations on content that works, pardon me, for social, I talk about, you know, like very targeted content, and that's the equivalent of when we would cover city council meetings and all that. Those are stuff people needed to know. We would call them DBI, dull but important, or oatmeal death, meaning that it was so boring that you flopped over into your oatmeal and suffocated. But you need to have those stories, and frankly, those stories are very important for SEO.
Yeah.
Then you have those other more fun stories that are takeoff on memes and with catchier titles and that are related to what you're doing, but they're not as related. And really, I mean, in newspapers, everything was related because as long as it was the community you covered, it was related. But we were always just like, what's the local angle? And that's the same thing as like, you know, how do I take bacon and relate it to my subject of, you know, widgets? And people somehow, you know, I'm not saying they do a good job of it necessarily, but it's the same sort of thing. It's taking the thing that you know that will interest people and figuring out how to relate it to your audience.
So which brings me to the next question. You're really active on Facebook. How did you figure out what the meat and potatoes? Because you've got huge numbers and you've got huge engagement. So you don't just have numbers because, you know, most people can say, well, she probably bought them. Well, of course, if they know you didn't. But, you know, hypothetically, let's go there and say, okay, you want a huge social. We can get you 30,000 likes on Facebook. We can get you fans, so on and so forth. But you, on the other hand, you have the meat and potatoes. How do you find that in order to build a community for company XYZ?
I think that a really big part of it is being true to yourself and figuring out who your audience is and who you want your audience to be. And I think it's interesting because I think Facebook, just in terms of company pages, is a lot more difficult than it was even 6 months ago or 6 months before that.
I agree.
And for me, what's interesting is that I never set up a business page or a fan page or whatever because I just figured, you know, whatever, I'll deal with that at some point in my life. And then when they started the follow button, I was really glad that I had never set up a fan page because then it made it so that it could, you know, I could have all those other, you know, other people on there. And the funny thing actually about my big numbers in terms of those following me is I have no idea how that happened. It was at 62, and then when they were deleting it, they went on that huge spam erasure thing. It went down to about 56,000 for a while, and now it's back up over 60. I have no doubt that great numbers of them are spam accounts that just go on there, and you know, because when the numbers were at one point, I was getting 1,000 new a day. I was on some list somewhere, and I don't know what list. I never found it. And I was getting huge amounts of spam comments. But I think that what happened with Facebook is that initially I was connected to people who I actually knew in real life, which, you know, is how everybody started on Facebook.
Sure.
And then it was people who I knew virtually. And then it was people who I met through other people who I knew virtually. And then it's people who have, you know, seen me speak or whatever and now follow me on Facebook. And I think the real key there, like what's made it continue to grow like that, is that I respond back. I like every comment that comes there. I mean, sometimes if I have a really busy day, I don't necessarily have time to respond back to every comment and tag every person who commented. But especially if they're adding something to the conversation, really, more than just a, oh, that's great, or I love this, I try to respond in some way, and I try to at least like everything so that people know that I read their comment, and I read every comment that is posted on my Facebook page, even if I don't respond to it. I've read every single comment. Sometimes with the new thing where they come out of order, when I'm on mobile, I get really confused and I'm not sure what I've read and what I haven't. But other than a few that I miss because of the wonkiness between mobile and desktop, I do read all of those comments, and I think that that's a very important thing. And when I've managed pages for others, I have made sure that I have liked every comment, and especially when we were in early days on building the page, I would respond back to every person, even if it just said thanks, just so they knew that someone was listening. And I think that that's a really important thing, that if you're building a community, they need to know that someone is actually
behind
the community. Yeah.
Right. So speaking of community, okay, so you've come up with the meat and potatoes and you know what it is. What are some measurements or signals, or is it likes, is it new fans, that will tell me as the quote-unquote department manager that's running a campaign, this was a successful campaign?
That's a really good question, and I think a lot of that comes down to...
Did you hear that, Doc? That was my question, and it was a really good question. You got to come up with a really good question now.
Even a blind squirrel will find the occasional acorn.
I think a lot of it comes down to what I always do at the very beginning. Is you have to figure out first what your criteria is, because if your goal is, you can go in and like you said, I mean, you can go on Microworkers or Fiverr and get a gazillion likes for nothing and they don't mean anything, and you can tell when there's 60 likes on something and no comments that something is askew there. There are some brands sometimes where their community is more like that, where they're not as chatty, but they will like things, and I have worked with some, and that's always a little surreal to me because it's they're not saying anything. What do I do? But in that case, they were far more concerned about click-through from Facebook. So the more likes that there were on stories tended to be the more click-through that there was. So in that case, community, building the community itself on Facebook in terms of interacting wasn't as vital. But interestingly, as conversation did increase slightly on Facebook and Twitter, they saw more comments on their own website. So to them, both the traffic and the increased engagement on their own site was their measure of success. But that was a publisher. So publishers have very different criteria than a retail company would. I think for a lot of retail companies, really a lot more of what they're doing is going to be about branding and building actual community where people are talking and sharing, so that when they're talking and sharing, their brand comes up on other people's feeds. Whereas for publishers, that they like that, they think, oh, that's nice, but then at the end of the day, they want to see that translates into something back home. So there are different ways of approaching it, and you can't really say what the right criteria are for a successful campaign at the end if you haven't said it at the beginning. You might come up with something that you didn't expect, like the increased engagement on the site. That we didn't have that as a specific goal at the beginning. we were hoping that once we cracked one nut that we could then, start talking about the on-site engagement. But as it turned out, that was part of it, and we didn't realize that was going to be part of it. So you can have those surprises, but you kind of have to know what your measurements are going to be going in, and be willing to be flexible if you find that something else came out of it that was equally as valuable.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, because I find that to be, with some clients that I've worked with in the past, different criterias, different goals, different campaigns will lay out what the important things are and what the unimportant things are. But I've always found it interesting that a lot of the articles I read, especially coming from marketing and SEO, what are the important KPIs? Where are your benchmarks? And so I just wonder, since you're not into, the SEOs, the marketings, the Google Analytics, your mindset, how do you look at measurement?
Well, it is that. It is sitting down at the very beginning and saying,
right.
What are your goals? Not what are your goals for Facebook, but what are your goals?
Right.
What is it that you're looking for? And what it used to be, like on a lot of promotional stuff when people were looking for, figuring out what kind of content would work well on Dig and sort of training in that. My first question would be like, well, what is it you want out of that? Do you want traffic? Do you want SEO traffic? Do you just want buzz? Do you want more link? And all of those, they were slightly different strategies, but they were slightly different. And I think it's the same with Facebook. And without sitting down, Facebook or Twitter and any of these sites, without sitting down and really figuring out what your that's really the first thing that I even talk to anyone about. I don't start talking about strategy right away. I ask them what they're doing. I want to look at all of their social accounts to start, just to see what's there and what may or may not be working. But also, what is the goal? Well, we want more Facebook likes, but why do you want more Facebook likes? What do you want the end result to be? And you sometimes have to keep asking and pulling and asking more questions and different questions, but eventually you get to that.
It's amazing how many clients can't answer those questions.
Right.
Yeah, they haven't even thought about it. I know. I'm that's one of the things that anytime I take on a new client, especially if I have a feeling that they're committed, because that's real important. The client has to be committed to do the work, because just because they hire us doesn't mean we're going to do everything. We'll do what we can, but they have to know what they want. And, aside from, I want more money, sure, we all want more money, but what are you willing to do in order to get there? Are you willing to engage your community? Are you willing to hire a writer? Are you willing to whatever? The commitment has to be there from both, not just you as the service provider, but them as the client.
Absolutely.
And that's been the struggle. They just want to hand it over to you and you do it. I can't tell you how many audits we've just give back to the client, and nothing's changed. So why did you just drop over $10,000 on a frickin' audit? If you're not going to change anything, or if you're not going to at least consider blogging, or consider whatever it is that we've found as a result of the data and the audit we just did.
Right.
So, especially with social, have you found that more corporate America, if you will, because I know you've worked as consulting and you've worked for corporations and non-corporations. Do you think that it's important for the top level management to be as involved, or can they just hand the baton to their VP or to a community manager and say, go for it, for whatever the campaign may be? Or does the CEO have to be part? Because I've noticed articles some say CEOs have to take part in the social in order to make it a successful blah, blah, blah. And some are saying, no, as long as you have a community manager, you know, so from you,
Well,
you've had experience on both.